Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jess Edberg, Executive Director of the Dorothy Molter Museum, and I'm here to educate, inspire, and entertain you with a pint-sized historical tale related to Ely Area history and about the time it takes to drink a pint of ale. If you're new, the history I share is not a deep dive, rather it scratches the surface using publicly accessible resources. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by all of these wonderful supporters, and it would not be possible without them. Additionally, if you know someone who may like this programming, all programs are available online via YouTube under the Dorothy Molter Museum's channel or as a podcast on your favorite platforms, and each program has a playlist available on Apple Music, which was migrated from Spotify. As with many topics I've covered, there is no shortage of information on the history of aviation, especially aviation in the Ely area. Aside from paring down the abundance of information on a given subject, one of the biggest challenges of preparing these programs is the amount of lived experience by our neighbors or their relatives. It's immense. With that being said, you should know that there are over 200 aviation museums in the US, plus more than 150 airport exhibits and over 2,500 total aviation-related sites or museums worldwide. So when I say aviation has a lot of historical data and information, it's an understatement. The desire to fly has existed since the dawn of humans. A sense of freedom, the escape of earthly limitations, satisfying a deep-seated curiosity to explore, the thrill of speed and height, and even the sense of conquering nature fuels this obsession. The earliest documented attempt to fly was in the Shandong region of China during the Warring States period of around 300 BCE. Using lightweight bamboo and silk, they established the structural principles of gliders and kites and built military reconnaissance kites that resembled birds and could measure distances, signal, and communicate over enemy lines. Later, in 400 BCE, Greek scholar Archytas of Taranto created bird-shaped air-propelled models called peristera, or dove in Greek. They were intended to provide controlled flight with ropes and propulsion by an air blast, but there is no record of a person testing one. Fun fact, Archytas invented the baby rattle, is credited with inventing the screw and the pulley, and has a lunar crater named after him. Another attempt to fly was made by the legendary 10th king of Britain in 852 BCE, Bladud, who was reputedly a practitioner of magic, necromancy, and the scientific arts. He was famous for founding the city of Bath after curing his leprosy in its hot springs, which he discovered with the help of his pigs. Ironically, he's also known as the, quote, Flying King for his tragic death when he jumped from the Temple of Apollo in London and fell straight to the ground wearing his DIY feather wings. Spoiler alert, this is a common theme. The credit for the first human flight goes to Abbas ibn Firnas, an Andalusian Berber from the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. Picture the scene: Cordoba, Spain, 875 BCE, a man 65 years old, dressed in feathers and holding a giant kite made of wood and silk and more feathers, launches off La Aruzafa Hills. He remains airborne for several minutes before crash landing and severely injuring his back. He said he should have built a long tail onto his glider to assist in landing, as wild birds do. Fun fact, Ibn Firnas also has a crater on the moon named after him. For centuries, birds continued inspiring pioneering flight inventors. Most well-known of these was Leonardo da Vinci and his flying machines. Designed largely in the late 1480s, they were visionary concepts based on studying bird and bat anatomy, aiming to achieve human flight through mechanical means. His most famous designs included the ornithopter, a flapping wing machine, and the aerial screw, a forerunner to the modern helicopter. Sadly, the lack of a light, powerful engine and lighter building materials prevented his designs from successfully flying. Successful sustained flight was achieved in September 1783 by the Montgolfier brothers, who launched the first untethered hot air balloon in France, but not with humans, with livestock. Their flight gave a sheep, a duck, and a rooster a phenomenal view of Versailles and proved living creatures could survive high altitude. In November, a flight with actual humans successfully flew across the English Channel. Very quickly, hot air balloons were incorporated into military service during the French Revolutionary War, but with no contingency for the use of rifles. By the end of the 18th century, English engineer George Cayley is the first to investigate and document the forces of flight: weight, lift, drag, and thrust, and develop the concept of the airplane as a fixed wing machine with systems for lift, propulsion, and control. 40 years later, a very confident William Henson registers a patent for an aerial steam carriage, an aircraft that had fixed wings, a steam powered engine, and propellers, but it never went beyond a scale model. It wasn't until the 1890s that well documented, repeated successful flights with gliders occurred by Otto Lilienthal of Germany, making the idea of heavier than air aircraft a reality. His patented work contributed to a greater understanding of flight aerodynamics. Unfortunately, like many before him, his risk tolerant life choices led to his untimely death due to his glider stalling out and an abrupt, uncontrolled landing from 50 feet in the air. 6,000 miles away, Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont was also planning. In 1901, he won the Deutsche de la Muerte Prize of 100,000 francs for flying the first powered airship around the Eiffel Tower, becoming one of the most famous people in the world with his flight recorded and published. He flew his Santos Dumont number 6, implying that there were 5 other airships that didn't make the cut. That's because number 5 left him hanging in a basket from the side of the hotel on the test flight. Somewhat concurrently, the Wright brothers had been conducting R&D in secrecy until in 1903 they performed the first controlled sustained flight of a 12 horsepower powered engine heavier than air aircraft with lateral and pitch control near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The first flight, piloted by Orville, lasted 12 seconds, covered 120 feet, and marked the beginning of the aerial age. They even inspired Alberto Santos Dumont to ditch the balloons for gasoline. The Wrights had cracked the code of aircraft control by developing the 3-axis control, which remains the foundational control system used in all fixed-wing aircraft today. In 1911, Italy was the first country to incorporate planes into the military during the Italian-Turkish War, but by the outbreak of World War I in 1914, companies and governments began expediting aircraft design for military purposes. That same year, the first commercial flight took off from St. Petersburg to Tampa, Florida. A huge development came from German engineer Hugo Junkers in 1916 when he introduced the all-metal airframe. The design quickly took off. His success ended in tragedy when the Nazis demanded he turn over ownership of all patents and market shares in 1933. He steadfastly refused, and in 1935, they executed him on his birthday. The introduction of air traffic control, or ATC, in the late 1920s, initially using flags to signal pilots, improved safety as flight became a more routine endeavor. To make sure we're all on the same page moving forward, in the simplest of terms, a biplane features 2 stacked sets of wings, whereas a monoplane is a fixed-wing aircraft with only 1 set of wings. A single engine has 1 engine, twin or dual has 2, tri-motor or engine has 3, and so on. After the war, there was an influx of propeller-based aircraft into the civilian market with an eye on the possibilities for revenue-earning passenger flights, giving rise to a facet of the new tourism industry in leisure and sightseeing flights, demonstrations, and air shows. Further bolstering industry growth, the Airmail Act of 1925, or Kelly Act, authorized the U.S. Postmaster General to contract with private airlines to carry mail, effectively privatizing airmail delivery and catalyzing the American commercial aviation industry by shifting responsibility from government operated planes to private firms and reducing costs. To improve and maintain safety standards, the Air Commerce Act was passed in 1926, issuing and enforcing air traffic rules, licensing pilots, certifying aircraft, establishing airways, and operating and maintaining aids to air navigation. Early on, planes became a common sight in the Ely area, especially on Chagua and Vermilion Lakes. The U.S. Forest Service quickly adopted this new technology, and in 1929, Cowish Ranger District Ranger Bill Triggs Sr. established the Ranger National Forest Seaplane Base on Chagua Lake, where local seaplane or float plane pilots began flying fire detection flights and hauling fire crews for the Forest Service. Trigg is considered one of the pioneers of the aerial photo system, set up in 1935 for inventorying and classifying timber and forest lands. The system was used to map fires and damage to trees from insects and diseases, as well as aid in locating trails, portages, roads, and railroads. Ely's remains the only standalone seaplane base in the entire United States and is followed by a large aviation enthusiast community. This new tool was the beginning of the end of using fire towers in our area. One of the more colorful early aviation stories in the area is that of Dusty Rhodes, but not to be confused with the late WWE wrestler of the same name. Clarence Ray Dusty Rhodes was a veteran airman and former exhibition flyer from Virginia, Minnesota, who started an aviation company with partner Merton Stephen Kingston, and heir to the Kingston Mining Company in Eveleth. The Kingston Roads Airways Service Incorporated was many things. It was Kingston's private pilot service, taking him back and forth to his seasonal residences. It was a commercial air service to the public and was a contract air service to the U.S. Forest Service's seaplane base in Ely. Rhodes had quite the reputation and seemed to fancy himself an aviation celebrity, mostly due to the plane that he employed. Rhodes had a 5-passenger Brom monoplane built by Ryan Aeronautical Company, the same firm that built Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. He named his the Spirit of St. Louis County. It was luxurious for the time and attracted a lot of attention at air shows by both spectators and other aviation professionals. Perhaps that's why he had these cards to hand out. Dusty also seemed to get wrapped up in the illegal fur trade in the late 1920s. He allegedly developed a regular air run, picking up illegal pelts by the hundreds and stashing them in a vehicle hidden on his property in Virginia. He was rumored to have bombed the Game and Fish Warden Seaplane headquarters on Fall Lake in Winton with skinned beaver carcasses. And it all came to a crashing halt when his home was raided in May of 1931. He escaped in the hidden pelt vehicle and disappeared to Michigan for many years. Other local pilots joined in on the fire spotting and burgeoning tourism industry, offering sightseeing and wilderness transport into the roadless area, now known as the Boundary Waters, to accommodate this commercial demand for access to fishing lakes. Scenic Airways was the first commercial tourist-focused aviation company to establish in Ely in May 1929. Herb Kervinen and Tony Somero incorporated the business with Dutch Fuller as their licensed pilot, who flew the company's 4-passenger Curtiss Robin. It was quite the news when the Ely Miner published the announcement stating the plane would offer 15-minute scenic trips flying at 100 miles per hour. The Curtiss Robin, introduced in 1928, is an American high-wing monoplane built by the Curtiss Robertson Airplane Manufacturing Company. It was known for its endurance and varied flying operations, including air shows and long-duration flights, and use by the United States and Paraguay militaries. Other planes that emerged during this rapid growth period included the Ford Trimotor, also called the Tin Goose, a pioneering American 3-engine all-metal transport monoplane manufactured by Henry Ford's Stout Metal Airplane Company between 1925 and 33. The Fairchild FC-2, a high-wing monoplane favored for its ability to carry heavy loads into remote locations, introduced in 1926. And the Stinson aircraft, introduced in 1920. Early Stinson models were used in northeastern Minnesota for operations, including initial fire detection and scouting. The Ely Seaplane Base transitioned to having its own pilots and planes in 1938 with its own four-seat Stinson SR-6A float plane. In 1933, Ely got its very own airport. The old airport, located where the softball fields and dog park are now, closed in the early 70s, and the new one is still located about 5 miles south of Ely on Highway 1. Although the old biplane stuck around for a while too. The Great Depression slowed progress of further advancements in design and technology, leaving some engineers and their companies in its wake. However, aviation got a boost when Amelia Earhart completed her solo nonstop transatlantic flight in 1932, becoming only the second to do so and the first woman to accomplish this feat. After the Great Depression, aviation shifted from a struggling, mostly male-dependent industry to a commercial passenger-focused business through technological advancements like the Douglas DC-3 in 1936. The Douglas DC-3 revolutionized air travel in the 30s and 40s as the first truly profitable commercial airliner, carrying 90% of global airline traffic by 1939. There was also a shift towards safety and regulation. The government increased oversight through the 1934 Airmail Act and the 1938 Civil Aeronautics Act, which ultimately created the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, improving safety standards, bringing structure to air routes, and forcing mergers that created modern airlines. In the 1930s and 40s, we also saw greater emphasis on airport improvements, transitioning from grass fields to paved runways with better terminal infrastructure, as well as greater comfort with amenities like stewardesses, hot meals, and sleeper berths to attract customers. Except in the bush of northeastern Minnesota, things remained pretty rustic. The Norden Norseman, a Canadian single-engine bush plane, was designed to operate from unimproved surfaces and came on the scene in 1935, quickly becoming an icon of wilderness aviation due to its tough as a rhino build and its ability to switch between wheels, floats, and skis. The Piper J3 Cub is another iconic American light aircraft produced between 1938 and 1947, renowned for its simplicity, low and slow flight characteristics, and distinctive Cub yellow paint. While originally designed as a trainer, it became a legendary bush plane and remains highly prized by backcountry pilots for its ability to operate from grass strips, beaches, and even hillsides. World War II accelerated aircraft development, moving from reconnaissance to fighter planes and heavy bombers. By the start of the war, mass-produced all-metal aircraft were standard. Those specialized wooden aircraft, like the de Havilland Mosquito, were still used. The war drove massive leaps in speed, engine power, and range, introducing radar, pressurized cabins, and jet propulsion. It established aircraft carriers as key naval assets, revolutionized industrial manufacturing, and set the stage for modern commercial aviation. After the war ended, there was a massive surplus of over 250,000 trained military pilots, creating a surge in general aviation, but only 400 airliners available to fly in 1945. However, Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, or the GI Bill, covered private pilot license training as part of its vocational and educational training programs. All of this led to a significant boom in civilian aviation, with many pilots purchasing their own aircraft. Here in Ely, more float plane bases had popped up. One on Sandy Point on Shago Lake, owned by Bill Leithold, who partnered with Holden Goldberg and Jack Isaac, as well as Wino Wirtanen, to operate a wilderness fly-in service and float plane school. After the war, more than 40 men signed up using their GI benefits. Fun fact, did you know that VCC, also known now as Minnesota North College, Vermilion, used to have a flight program? One of these World War II veterans was Chick Beale. After getting his pilot's license, he was promptly hired by Leithold Base, and in Bob Carey's book, Bush Pilots, said flying bush in the early days could get pretty hairy. In those early days, the navigation systems were DIY. Pilotage and dead reckoning were the first and continue to be foundational aviation navigation methods. Pilotage involves navigating by identifying visible landmarks, while dead reckoning uses pre flight calculations of time, wind speed, airspeed, and heading to estimate position based on a known starting point. Some airstrips had lit ground beacons and low frequency radio communication, but poor visibility, low light, weather fronts, and birds were all airborne hazards. Several deadly plane crashes occurred here in the early years. One of the more well known stories is from April 1932, when Dutch Fuller and Herb Kervinen, Toivo Toby Somero, and Matt Bill Somero of Ely died in a Duluth crash due to a whiteout snowstorm. What made this story more heart-wrenching at the time was that both Herbert Kervinen and Dutch Fuller were injured, but walked away when their plane crashed at Finn Hill in Ely just the week before. They even made a commemorative postcard of the Ely crash scene. Chick Beale and Milt Nelson, working for the Forest Service, developed a snorkel system that installed on float planes to quickly collect water for firefighting. The system, still used today, employs an F-86 fuel tank as a water tank with a long tube that attaches to the plane's float so the base opening hits the water and the top opening points into the water tank. When the pilot lands on the water at 55 miles per hour, it forces water up the tube, filling the tank within 8 seconds, enabling the plane to immediately take off and head to the wildfire. Can you hear Chick and Milt saying, "Work smarter, not harder"? The 1950s and 60s saw a burst of innovation at the Ely Seaplane Base. In addition to fire suppression tools, staff also engineered a tree seeding hopper and a fish stocking system using an existing 18-inch camera hatch in the belly of the plane that Bill Trigg Sr. had used for his photography techniques. Although the Forest Service Seaplane Base started with a variety of planes, they eventually became de Havilland diehards. Initially starting with Stinsons, they also utilized a Piper J4 Cub Coupe, a Norseman, a Seabee, and several Cessna 180 and 185 Skywagons. But once the de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver came online, it was over. The de Havilland Beaver is a legendary single-engine, high-wing, short takeoff and landing, propeller-driven aircraft, famously known as the ultimate bush plane. Produced between 1947 and 67, 1,657 units were built to operate in rugged remote environments using wheels, floats, or skis, and between 600 to 700 are still in use. The Beaver was engineered with bush flying in mind by taking all the best aspects of all the planes that came before and created a Frankenstein plane in the best way possible. The resulting bird still remains the gold standard for Northwoods bush piloting, and as retired Ely Forest Service pilot Pat Lowe says, is known as the Harley-Davidson of bush planes. Other popular planes used in the Ely area included the Aeronca Champion, commonly known as the Champ or Air Knocker, a classic tandem seat high wing tail dragger produced between 1945 and 51. Known for its docile, forgiving flight characteristics, it was designed as a superior alternative to the Piper Cub and was often used for flight training and leisure flying. The Beechcraft Bonanza 4 to 6-seater single engine was introduced in 1947 by Beech Aircraft Corporation of Wichita, Kansas, and has been in continuous production longer than any other aircraft in history. The Cessna 172 Skyhawk and 182 Skylane came on the scene in the mid-50s, extremely popular for training and personal use. Fun fact, Jacqueline Jackie Cochran was a pioneering American aviator and business executive who held more speed, altitude, and distance records than any other pilot in history at the time of her death in 1980. Rising from extreme poverty, she became a central figure in 20th century aviation, most notably as the first woman to break the sound barrier on May 18, 1953. The 1950s also signaled a shift in the use of planes in the Ely area. Helicopters slowly replaced how supplies were deployed into the roadless areas. Going from parachuting in the crates and hoses by float plane, helicopters started lowering them to the ground by cable. It was also the end of the flying fishing resort in the Boundary Waters. President Truman's 1949 executive order took full effect, banning all flights below 4,000 feet over the wilderness. According to the U.S. Forest Service, number of float planes flying out of Ely increased from a daily average of 11 in 1945 to 69 by 1948. This significant increase raised concerns and controversy over the preservation of the wilderness character of the area and the abundant wildlife, including fish, that drew people here in the first place. The Isaac Walton League led the effort to persuade President Harry Truman invoke authority under the Air Commerce Act of 1926 and sign an executive order to establish an airspace reservation, quote, for national defense and other governmental purposes over what is now the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, creating the world's first airspace reservation. It was codified in the Wilderness Act of 1964. This drastically changed the economic landscape of the Ely area. Resorts that relied on float planes to fly wealthy guests, their gear, and perishables in for quick weekend trips saw their business models collapse. With air taxis grounded, operators had to shift their focus toward canoe outfitters, guiding services, and providing rowboats for guests willing to navigate the extensive portage networks. It also triggered the evolution of the root beer lady's origin story and marked the beginning of a phased elimination of motorized access in the wilderness, which was another program 2 years ago you can also access on YouTube. Elwyn West, a legendary barnstormer and bush pilot from Wisconsin, started West's seaplane service on Shagwa. At the time, gray wolves had a bounty, and West was one of the services offering wolf hunting by plane. He became very frustrated with the flight ban and bit his thumb at the government. Elwyn was known to have a bit of a temper to begin with, having punched out an FAA official and losing his pilot's license. His connections to a Wisconsin senator allowed him to get it back. Elwyn became even more famous for defying the 1949 airspace ban over the Boundary Waters, resulting in the federal seizure of his planes in the summer of 1953. Although flights over the Boundary Waters were prohibited, it didn't stop another Ely legend, William Pat McGee, from starting Wilderness Wings Airways in 1953. Pat McGee was a Marine veteran who also used his GI Bill benefits to take flying lessons from Chick Beale after he bought a Piper J4 Cub with floats. It was in his blood. His father was one of the first pilots in Minnesota and held Minnesota pilot's license number 8, signed by Orville Wright himself, but had it revoked in 1923 when, for a bet of $50, he flew his Curtis Jenny biplane in a half loop and 180-degree twist through the Duluth's aerial bridge and then back over the top. Wilderness Wings Airways opened at the former location of Lythal Base at Sandy Point on Shagwa Lake. For 25 years, it operated as a flight school, a Cessna aircraft retailer who at one point was the world's most prolific Cessna seller, fire patrol and air taxi for those fishing at remote camps, and as an emergency responder. Pat and his staff completed over 700 emergency flights and instructed hundreds of young pilots. He was also a movie star. Well, you may not have known, but he worked a bit with Hollywood, and in the movie The Phantom, filmed in Thailand, he was known as the body double for Catherine Zeta-Jones. Unfortunately for us, Wilderness Wings was lost in a fire in 1980, and Pat went on to operate successful operations in both Alaska and Hawaii. He continued to receive accolades, published books, and in 1924, 2 years after his passing, was inducted into the Minnesota Aviation Hall of Fame. Today, the air traffic is much slower, but the float planes we see overhead are more likely than not one of the 3 red and white beavers from the seaplane base on Shagwa. The current fleet of 3 de Havilland beavers was acquired in 1957, 1959, and 1967. 2 were bought brand new, and the third from the Army. And like many machines built more than 3 decades ago, if you take care of them right, they'll last forever. The Forest Service has added a multitude of modifications to the aircraft, including improvements for stabilization and increased weight loads, state of the art navigation technology, and communication capabilities, as well as the aforementioned mechanisms, all custom fabricated at the hangar in Ely. With 3 pilots and 1 mechanic, these staff are responsible for an incredible amount of mission types. With the many hazards for pilots in the Northwoods, they got pretty creative in modifications to their planes to make the work requirements safer and more efficient. From wildfire detection and suppression, wildlife surveys, search and rescue, medevac, and hauling supplies year-round, the seaplane base supports both the Superior and Chippewa National Forests, including the Boundary Waters, as well as assisting Lake, Cook, and St. Louis counties. Pat Lowe shared that bush flying is very different than commercial flying, as the unpredictability and high reliance on a pilot's judgment make it more challenging. Bush pilots flying float planes into remote lakes have to judge not just the wind and weather, but also understand the seasonal changes in lake levels, ice thickness and slush presence, and landmark changes due to storms, fire, or disease. It's not for everyone. But don't feel like you missed out. Local aviation companies still exist for recreational flights, lessons, charters, or other services with companies as close as Tower, Eveleth, Cloquet, and Duluth. If you're already a private pilot, there is a privately owned sea base on Eagle's Nest 4. If you'd like to get a front row seat to the Forest Service planes, you can watch them from the Ely City Public Dock, located just a few hundred feet north of the facility. Or if time allows, you can call and request a visit, but know that they are often very busy. Thank you so much for being here. Very special thanks to Anne at the Ely Winton Historical Society, Pat Lowe, retired U.S. Forest Service pilot, and Tim the mechanic at the Seaplane Base for helping make this program a success. And if you want to learn more about past programs, remember to check online at the Dorothy Molter Museum channel on YouTube. This is the last program for the 2025-26 season, and we hope to see you this coming season in October 2026. Thanks, and have a fantastic and safe summer.